living with a new crisis, globalization, climate change, and the environment. This lecture examines the background to the current crisis of globalization and the problems surrounding policies to combat climate change through transitions out of dependence on carbon. After providing a critique of the current situation, I want to argue that there are fundamental flaws in the way that policy has addressed both agency and structure in relation to climate change. It argues for a need to draw away from the path dependence that helped to define mainstream policy initiatives which are focused on individual consumer behavior, and argues for a stronger recognition of structural inequalities internationally and nationally as the cornerstone of an alternative green political stance. If we've now arrived at a tipping point on climate change, as the IPCC said, we need to address the problem of decarbonisation through an approach that goes well beyond market mechanisms and requires social and political mobilisation. It constitutes a new challenge to the social sciences and to understandings of globalisation. Historically, the last few decades of the 20th century witnessed a series of crises over the environment and the economy. The apparent incompatibility between economic growth and environmental sustainability came to mean two things. On one account, the limits of resource capacity were in danger of being exceeded. Resource shortages were a constraint on further economic growth and development, and we should conserve resources to facilitate growth. This was essentially the limits to growth position in the early 1970s, Meadows and Co. But second, existing levels of economic growth represented a threat to the environment and resources. A vicious circle had been created in which economic activity undermined the biospheric resources on which we rely. This is, if you like, the weak green position usually referred to as sustainable development, which evolved largely since the 1980s. A stronger view of sustainable development would imply much lower levels of substitution between human-made and natural capital and corresponding discount rates. The first position, conservation for growth, lost support partly because it was a product of high energy prices, the oil hikes of the 1970s. As hydrocarbons became relatively cheaper and the effects of the Green Revolution, expanding food staples to meet population growth, began to be acknowledged, it was no longer clear that the Malthusian position held, that population exceeded the resources necessary to feed this growth, and the drive for economic development in the South, circa the Brandt Report, was overtaken by events. At first, it was put in jeopardy by the debt crises of the 1980s, the structural adjustment policies, and the post-recovery, the deregulation of markets, the retreat of the state, and eventually higher levels of economic growth in much of the newly developing world, especially the populous economies of Asia. The genius of the second position, what was often termed sustainable economic development, was that almost everyone could sign up to it. There were a few dissenting voices, but the mechanism which are unleashed via deregulation and the neoliberal ascendancy became the favoured instruments of policy in seeking to achieve sustainable development. These were undertaken under the Washington Consensus, a consensus, incidentally, in which most people had not been consulted. So it took two forms. First of all, attempts were made to internalise environmental externalities in products and services, ecological modernisation. This was viewed as a competitive strategy by the European Union in particular, giving Europe a competitive advantage over the United States and any newly developing rivals. Basically, you count the embodied carbon in products, seek to reduce energy and material throughput, and make a win-win gain by reducing energy costs. Hydrocarbon prices were rising and reducing environmental damage. Trade arrangements would also take account of embodied carbon. The more interventionist policies of the European Union facilitated this in the 1990s. Second, the development of carbon markets, both from within industries and, more importantly, between countries. These new markets represented a challenge for entrepreneurship. New market opportunities required very little government action. Carbon markets were thus popular among devotees of free market economics and environmentalism, unlike other interventions such as carbon taxes. Although very few paused to consider what might happen when markets fail and the price of carbon dropped significantly. The conversion of governments to a more or less uncritical view of markets was even more evident in the international efforts to protect biodiversity. The biodiversity regime was expressed in the Convention on Biological Diversity, 1992, and the Cartagena Protocol on Biosafety, 2000. This demonstrated a shift from a focus on the loss of species diversity, and thus the loss of complex ecosystems, to a focus on the preservation of genetic diversity, where the principal gains were in the pharmaceutical industries and agriculture. Again, the almost imperceptible shift was from nature conservation to nature as commodity. The main opposition to the latter was from groups, mainly NGOs, which argued that marginalized peoples had rights in nature, which governments and the pharmaceutical industry ignored. However, the industry lobby won much of the ideological struggle, insisting that ex situ conservation in gene banks should be treated as equivalent to in situ conservation in ecosystems. So from a radical perspective, the conjunction of newly liberated markets and environmental concern was a necessary contradiction of neoliberal policy seeking a resolution. A more mainstream view, however, would be that they address system failures, could even lead to a rejuvenated, if scarcely recognizable, type of materialism-light capitalism. That's part one.